Welcome back to Conversations at the Leaky Cauldron, Episode 9, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Chapters 1 through 6. And we find ourselves on this now 5th volume of this 7-volume journey, past the halfway point on another giant book, and back on their broomsticks with me, or rather back on the bench with me, swigging down some butterbeer, are Miss Sarah Miller and Mr. Wesley Schantz. Welcome back, you two.
Yeah, good to be back.
Good to be back. Great intro, Alex.
Thank you. I thought I would give it my best. You know, it is a new beginning right now. And I was thinking about that right before we started, about how the closer you get with people and the farther in you get. So not only with the book and these characters, but with you all, and there is social science to back this up, the sort of more you take them for granted. And I can find the specific study for you. It's found that the people you are least polite to in the world are the people you know best. And actually people who, in another study I could find that Peterson mentions, people who are about to get divorced become more and more polite to each other, though more and more physiologically aroused, indicating that the more comfortable you are with people, the less you care about social conventions, but also the less the less you play a role with them, and the more you sort of take their existence take their existence for granted. Yes, because they are like the tree outside of your window that is always there. And so I was thinking about that in relation to this book and in relation to y'all, just because we had recently sort of jumped out of that and taken a moment to appreciate what we've been doing here. It really is quite incredible that we are past the halfway point, even though these last few books are so long. And I'm really quite impressed with both of you, and really appreciative of this project that spans all the way back to this summer. And I mean, it has withstood the school year very nicely, I would say.
Yeah, with the pressure of our school year, I had my hesitations that we wouldn't be able to make this happen regularly. So I'm glad to see that we have.
Yeah, it's been I haven't felt like it's been that long, but when did we start in the summer?
Pretty early in the summer. I think we've been doing this for about 8 months now. I think it was in June that we started. And I think we are about 40 episodes in or so. Now that we changed the name, I can't just tell by our name, but yeah, we've been doing this for quite a bit. So, well, I guess let's jump in with that in mind. So the 6 chapters we talked about today were Dudley Demented, A Peck of Owls. Are they really called A Peck of Owls? I know about A Murder of Crows. The Advanced Guard, the Avant-Garde for our Francophiles. Harry, I have here a note, Harry's Attitude. That's not its own chapter, but I would like to touch on that theme. It seems like he's pretty angry in this book. Chapter 5, number 12, Grimmauld Place, another numbered, interesting, magical place, and the noble and most ancient House of Black. And so, well, where would y'all like to start with? Dementors in the real world, whatever A Peck of Owls is, this Advanced Guard thing, numbers. What's on y'all's mind?
Well, I guess I'll go. Something that I noticed, and I've noticed when I have read this book in the past, and I think it's pretty well reflected in the film, but this particular film is way different from the book.
I was noticing
really
the movie is nothing like it.
Yes. I mean, I think the movie captures a lot of the essence of the book, but there's so much that you can't do in the movie for the sake of time. I think it captures the atmosphere which is really an interesting comment on how books can be adapted to the screen, but that's for a different conversation. I was just going to say roundabout that I really like Harry's attitude, and I often, whenever I say this, I often am faced or met with the harsh disagreement from others. but I really like his imperfection here, and like I feel for him. I think his anger is by and large really justifiable, and I'm curious how you guys reacted to it this time around.
I remember vaguely, I think, now that I'm rereading this, when this book came out, how people, maybe this was the one, I forget, but people were like commenting on how angry Harry is all of a sudden. And I guess I never was that bothered by it either. Yeah, like I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that I really admire him particularly at this point, but I can sort of sympathize with him, I suppose. And the evocation of the boredom of the summer is pretty powerful. Like with him, laying on the ground to listen to the news, like it doesn't get much worse than that. So, if he's angry, that's understandable, I guess, is how I kind of look at it.
Yeah, and just to speak to very quickly to the difference between the movie and the book, I know you said it's another conversation, but it is interesting. I completely agree with you that the movie gets the atmosphere or the essence of the book without having the particulars that make it what it is, and that is an interesting sort of question, not only in translation from book to movie, but in language to language. Do you try and get the sense of the language or the literal language? And here the sense has been chosen, because something that I had forgotten about, because I had not read this book in so long, because I didn't read these last books as many times as I read the first 3 books. Maybe because they were shorter, maybe because they were the beginning of things, and I was at the beginning of things as a young person, so I identified more with that. But I didn't remember the vicious argument that Dudley and Harry have, where they really dig deep on each other like brothers. It's a real Cain and Abel sort of moment. And I wondered if the coming of the Dementor, if we were going to do a sort of symbolic, allegorical interpretation here, a coming together of primary and secondary world, whether that's sort of like a moment of choice for Harry, where he might act like a Voldemort, where he might take out in like a Cain-like or Abel getting revenge on Cain-like way on his cousin for saying the wrong things to him, that he might take that out on him by use of magic, by use of force, by evil use of power at this moment. And then just the fact that the Dementors show up right in that moment. I wonder if that's almost either A, a godsend for him, and B, whether that's symbolic of the situation that was produced between them and the potential for something terrible to be done that puts Harry on the path of Voldemort.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, when I remember reading this the first time, and when he saved Dudley, my first thought was exactly that he is never going to get the credit that he deserves for saving his cousin.
Right.
And I think like that's part of what pisses him off, right? But he's pissed for a lot of reasons, which I think are worth unpacking. Like, what exactly is the root of his rage? I think it's less about what's going on right now and more about like not having really dealt with the role that he played begrudgingly in the rise of someone who killed his parents. And I think there's a lot of like self anger as much as there is anger outwardly. But anyway, like as soon as he saved Dudley, which of course he had to do, I mean, he's the hero, but like, but on the other hand, he didn't have to. And in doing so, I think it really exemplifies that line, like, where Cain says to God, like, God says, "Where's your brother?" And he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And like, I think very often the idea that Cain actively hurts Abel, I mean, that's obviously borne out in the story, but what does that look like in our world? Like, you can do harm to a lot of people without actively hurting them, but by just not intervening to help them, right? And that, like, is it my job to take care of other people who aren't me or who aren't like me? it's really easy to, I think, and like to pretend like that's not as bad as Cain, but because you're not actively hurting somebody, but I think the point of obviously of the story and of later in the New Testament is that like actually no matter who that person is, they are your brother. And yes, actually you are your brother's keeper. And I think that this first scene is just like, that's how hard it is to be your brother's keeper. You have to protect them from suffering, even if you absolutely hate their like living, breathing guts. And they stand for everything that has kept you unhappy and caused you pain and suffering. Like that decision is, I think, what separates Cain from Abel. And I think that's a really good story to think about, because it's hard not to think about that now that you bring it up. But yeah, I remember thinking like, man, he's never going to get the credit for being a good guy, because he never does. And I think that's why it becomes easier and easier to just be like, not my job, right? I'm not going to get any positive benefit out of intervening, standing up for somebody who isn't, like me, stepping up to the plate, protecting others doesn't help me in the long run, right? So the less and less we acknowledge those people, the easier it is to, I think, fall into that kind of Cain-like behavior where you just don't care who somebody else is in relationship to you. What do you guys think?
I hadn't really thought about that connection, but I think it is interesting how Dudley has started going down the wrong path at this point, like hanging out with the wrong crowd, or maybe leading the wrong crowd to being the wrong crowd by being who he is, and he's a pugilist now. At this point, he's getting some accolades for being big and mean, basically, and that's not great. But I'm wondering if maybe that is part of Harry's, things that Harry has not really dealt with, I guess, is, he's put in a position where to save his own life, he has to also save Dudley's life. That's kind of how it looks anyway. And so he actually can't work the spell, which is surprising given that he's had a lot of practice with this spell and he's really good at it. So I feel like there is something kind of there that's blocking him, and it's the sight of his friends' faces that unblocks it, right? That's who he hasn't seen all summer and who he was expecting to hear from a lot, and they just haven't been there for him. So I'm sure that's part of it too. And that, I think that makes it a little different than the Cain and Abel story maybe, but anyway, he also actively directs the stag, the Patronus. He tells it what to do, which I think is new. I'm not sure if I'm forgetting, but he tells it directly to go this way, and then he whips around and he has him go and get the one that's above Dudley, right? So it's he's doing more with the spell in a way than he's had to do. He's more sort of actively directing it, and maybe that's because he has to, because it's not coming as naturally to him. He's not doing things unthinkingly as much, and he has to really kind of force himself to do it this time.
Well, at the very least, he is the antagonist in the situation with Dudley, which is not how it's portrayed in the movie. In the movie, he's portrayed as sort of like a loser sitting on the swing set while Dudley and his friends are sort of hanging out together. And then Dudley sort of antagonizes him in the presence of his friends in a very understandable way. And then Harry sort of whips out his wand and everybody laughs at him except for Dudley, who understands what that means. That's not exactly how it goes down here. Harry starts calling Dudley Big D after he stops hanging out with his friend Piers, that wrong or bad element that you mentioned before, that element that's turning bad because of their association with Dudley and his particular character, now the pugilist, as you said. And Harry keeps calling him Big D. How long have you been Big D then? And shut it, snarled Dudley, turning away again. And cool name, said Harry. I said shut it, said Dudley. Don't the boys know that's what your mom calls you? Oh, yeah, Didikins, he said earlier. Harry's really it looks to me sort of like what the Jungians call transference, or excuse me, not transference, but displacement of an emotion. Because what just happened at the end of the fourth book? Well, Cedric got killed and the Dark Lord came back. And the entire time during the fourth book, Harry was dealing with the press. So he dealt with infamy before in the second book. But then having this sort of like conscious press campaign against him was pretty rough too. And now he's like actively picking fights with the guy who's sort of like his brother, who is now having praise lavished on him by his friends, calling him Big D, as well as his mom and his dad. It's sort of like how what I'm teaching in Dante right now is the sphere of Mars Cacciaguida from Cantos 14 to 18 in the Paradiso, where Cacciaguida explicitly says the justice of the world is very much bitter. It's inverted and upside down, and bitter is its taste, as in, you know, you don't get what you deserve in the world. And I feel like, just to speak to both your point and to Sarah's, that is sort of what brings out the Cain potentially in Harry, but also what justifies this sort of overweening anger he has. I also agree with you, Wes, that I wouldn't say I hold him admirable, but I do think his anger is, I would feel the same way he feels in the same circumstance as he is in. I think that's interesting. See, I like that he has imperfections, right? Like, I think a hero without flaw is so boring. And I know that that's maybe a modern, I think it's great to see him, and we've seen him be imperfect, right? Like in his classes and in his treatment of Hermione at times, or in his folly, right? We've seen him be imperfect, or his short-sightedness, but we've never really seen him like actively like a shithead, right? Like to people. And, you know, like like you said, like he's picking on Dudley. What I think is interesting is that Dudley is Big D, right? But he does point out that Dudley, you know, picks on people who aren't his own size, which we've known all along, right? Dudley has picked on Harry, who can't really physically fight back. And we saw that at the end of book 4, right? Voldemort dueling with somebody who is not even close to his peer in terms of education. And I wonder if there's something about that really pisses off Harry, like he's in these stages of reaction, and he sees in Dudley some of the same shit that he sees in Voldemort, somebody who gathers people to himself, who loves to be praised by them, feared rather than loved, and who picks on people who aren't his own size, right? And, you know, Harry can't do anything about Voldemort because he doesn't even know where the heck he is, but he can scare Dudley, right? And I think that's another dimension of it, maybe. The other thing I think too is that, I just lost my train of thought. Anyway, just that one. I hate when that happens, by the way. And that happens to me all too often. Yeah, Wes.
Oh, I was just gonna comment on the use of capital letters. I don't know if this is that interesting, but it just sort of leapt out at me as I was reading it this time that it's a thing that Rowling does quite a bit, actually. She uses the caps lock to like represent the shouting stuff, you know, but she also tends to do it when it's like, you know, a really important spell, because normally spells are in Latin or sort of Latinate, you know, and then they're italicized, which is fitting, I guess. But in this case, it's like you get sort of both of those things. So there's just like this eruption of, you know, anger plus magic, which is kind of a new thing to see coming from Harry, I think. And yeah, it does kind of, it makes him a little more interesting maybe, and a little more relatable. It's also the case that like this use of magic is really problematic in lots of ways, not least like legalistically, as we'll see it, like it forms kind of the first arc of the whole thing where he's like in trouble for using magic, right? He's going to get expelled. That's part of it, but it's also problematic because it's like it's this spell that means so much to him, that was like he saw his father using it, and it's like it's a very personal spell in a lot of ways, that the stag that comes out is sort of the representation of his ideal of his father, right? But it's also this thing that he's forced to save this person that he despises, and he does it again, like he does it with great difficulty, and I don't think that's accidental.
Well, isn't that?
Oh yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, isn't that maybe also just a parallel to what he? Sorry. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I was just going to say, like, isn't that sort of a parallel to what he experienced in the graveyard? Like, and I think it's a nice foreshadowing of what we learn at the end of the 5th book in the Department of Mysteries. If you don't remember that part, we'll get to it soon. But just this idea that like fates can be intertwined, right? Like there's no such thing as saving only good people and not saving people who maybe quote unquote don't deserve it or something like that. Like
right.
You either do what's right or you don't do what's right. And either one of those has consequences. But I think another theme of the book that will emerge is that, like, yeah, the stag from his Patronus represented his father, but his notion of who his father was like extremely incomplete and romanticized, idealized, cleansed of imperfections, right? Of truth. And the truth about who his father was is not something that he has access to, because he's wearing the wrong kind of glasses, or maybe because he doesn't have all the information, but that like he's going to start to learn more and more about other people who he's previously written off, or who everyone says are crazy, like, or loony, but now he's in a position to see things with new eyes, I think, and maybe the fact that he's now experiencing magic, and it's really powerful, but it's almost born of anger and rage, or it's I don't know, it's somehow compounded by that. Like, stuff is new for him now, and as well it should be, because he just saw someone die, right, in front of him. Someone whose life he very well could have saved had he not suggested that they take the cup together, or something like that.
Right. And we'll see that later with the Thestrals, and seeing them, and again, continuing to see those layers of things we could not see before. And I think that's such an interesting connection you're making, because I think what you're saying is part of the reason why he couldn't summon the Patronus charm, and how you were connecting that with how his vision of his father is going to alter, get more sophisticated and darken, is that his Patronus there is a representation of his perception, not only of his father, but of the great father, his civilization and his people, and that he no longer has access to sort of the pure childish joy that he had before, which allowed him to cast a Patronus, thinking that the father would give him pure protection. But now he sort of there's an element of perfunctoriness, and there's also that death looming behind him. And it's almost like the happy thought that once gave him strength no longer has the right juice. He has to organize his personality now to deal with the more sophisticated and darker world, in order to achieve the same effect. He has to fight the darkness within himself as he reconstitutes himself, it seems like.
Which is something that we've talked about all along at different points, but that it really does seem important, like who the caster of the spell is and where they are in their development. Like the spell is more obviously than just the words and the movement of the wand, but if he has to recalibrate and re-identify a new memory that makes him feel the happiest and warmest in the world, that can conjure this Patronus, it suggests that like I don't know, that the magic that they have to perform is somehow like evolves within the person as well.
Bang. That's great. And I wanted to connect that too with the idea that you both just gave me, that remember when Mad Eye Moody first taught the Avada Kedavra curse, and he was like, you can't just say it. You got to put some powerful magic behind it. I wondered if that was also sort of what we were seeing with the Patronus too, and what you were noting, Wes, with the not only the italics but the capital letters, because he tries expecto patronum at first, lower, the capital E, capital P, but lowercase rest of the words. But then expecto patronum, which we remember from the movies, he has to really mean it. He has to have some emotional force behind it, sort of like how Avada Kedavra has to have like some emotional force behind it. And I wonder if they're supposed to be opposing sort of magics, and whether you would also connect that to sort of holy versus meteor, that Harry Potter is here sort of harnessing the same force that gives Voldemort power, but using it towards different ends.
It makes me think of, Voldemort's elaborate plan to capture Harry Potter. He could have just had his agent Bartimus Crouch, right, Jr., just cast Avada Kedavra on Harry in the middle of class, right? Harry's dead,
Right.
end, right? But he doesn't. He just can't let anyone else do the spell, right? The spell is determined by the person, it seems like, and that's like the whole point of. I guess that's kind of the whole point of the story.
Yeah, well, and so I'm tempted just to say, and what do you think that means? But yeah, so I do want to ask you, what do you think that means, that the spell, though has sort of a traditional or generalized structure, ultimately derives its power from the person? Is that sort of like how Dante suggests that the roles that exist derive their powers from individual people and how well they play them? Something like that. What are you thinking?
I'm just thinking, like, each of these books is Harry Potter and the such and such, right? It's like he's the central character, and so we have no story without him. That's all I meant by it, really.
Okay. So speaking of our further darkening view of things, or I suppose I'm saying darkening as if things are literally getting darker, and I guess literally they are, and that does seem to be the narrative arc that fantasy epics take. I think we'll see that again both with Narnia and with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But I think it's more that it gets dark because you start to see more of what exists. It's as if your immediate projection is Edenic, or like a golden age when you first come here. It's like it's a place of escape when we first come to this world. And this is something Wes and I have sort of been talking about in Final Fantasy VII too, Sarah, as we get to the second half of that very, very long game and endeavor. It's like at first this fantasy world offers you an escape, but then it shows you a mirror. And I think it's almost like that's what great fantasy epic literature does. It draws you in with its siren's call of another world, and then bang, it shows you smack dab, it measures you. It shows you smack dab in your face what exists in all worlds, and thus who you are and who you would be in a different world, I think, as well.
That's a really interesting formulation. I think it sounds like I have literally no experience with Final Fantasy 1 through 7. I assume that there's 1 through 6 since it's numbered 7, but I think Tolkien's, the essay on fairy stories would kind of back you up on that evaluation, that escape is definitely a primary function. I always get the vibe that this one is darker, maybe because the emotions are darker, maybe because there isn't as much like fun. I mean, I think there's Quidditch in this book, but they're not school supply shopping and having ice cream at Florian Fortescue's. There's none of like the kiddie stuff. I think there is some discussion of like really fun jokes that Fred and George are developing, but even behind those jokes, those are some like dark pranks. I mean,
yeah. And they're insubordinate. I think we see them in a different light in this book when we really get to them.
Yeah, I mean, the whole house of 12 Grimald Place is dark. It's darkened. It's like damp. There is a lot of like physical darkness. You know, and of course our primary world has a lot of darkness. There's also a lot of light in it, but you know, maybe we're coming to the point where you kind of have to be engulfed in things that are dark in order to see how light maybe breaks through. There's this person I follow on Instagram who I really like, and she talks about pain, waiting, and rising, and how that is like, that's just kind of life. I mean, it's a very Christian way of looking at life. That's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But I mean, I think there's a lot of Christological elements here. I know I've said that before, but yeah.
I was just looking at the sort of the magic question and thinking about like the perspective that we get on the way that it's like so dangerous. Like we were talking about this a little before, but you know, it's so dangerous that it has to be like very forcibly restricted, you know, and the way that so many people are so concerned with Harry Potter, like particularly with his use of magic. Like it matters a lot with everybody, obviously, because it's always magic. But there is something special about Harry, right? Where he gets the peck of owls that comes out after his use of unregistered magic or whatever, right? There's like, it's kind of comical how quickly and thick and fast they come flying through. How he is forced to sort of like explain himself, you know, but he can't explain himself to anybody who matters. So he's just like forced to explain himself to his uncle and his aunt, and then it turns out, right, that that his aunt knows way more than she's been letting on, like all along. It turns out that Mrs. Fig, the crazy cat lady, has been a magical person all along, even though she's a squib and can't actually use magic. You know, she does sort of like have cat magic of some kind because she seems to communicate with Mr. Tibbles. So, but like, there's apparently like way more magic going around, and it's just like very effectively kept hidden. It seems to be like the message here, and Harry, like what he's done is especially bad, like in ways he doesn't even realize by using magic in front of somebody else. You know, he knows he's not allowed to do it. He had to do it, and everyone's telling him like it's going to be okay, you'll get off. But there is something like, there's something profane about that almost, right? To use magic in a way that's like out there in the regular old world. You know, almost like something that is so personal to you that you're like letting out there, you know, sort of like the reason that he gets insulted in the first place, like Dudley talking about his parents, right? It's kind of the same thing that he's just done. He's taken magic out and sort of shown it where it can't be allowed.
And on that note, just of sort of an inappropriate vulgarizing or desacralizing or secularizing, or what is the actual technical term for profaning? That is the word you used, right? When, like what you would do if you caught the Ark of the Covenant if it were falling off its holsters. But also the Dementor being there in Privet Drive is itself also a trespass upon the normal world. And I wonder, and I might not be seeing this right because I've made this point earlier, and so it might mean something else, but still agree with your point along different lines. But how is it, is the Dementor also a symbol showing up here in the normal world of how the primary and the secondary world are supposed to now be actively interacting, we are now supposed to sort of be seeing more of ourselves in these books, or learning about our own worlds in these books rather than simply escaping from it, that is happening now has an element of darkness and thus is more complex and sophisticated. And so we as readers are expected to, I don't know, bring the lessons from the secondary world into the primary world, embody them in our own lives, or is it on a weaker level just that we should be in some way that the fictional worlds in which we find ourselves have an effect on the real world in which we live, and that's why we indulge in those worlds, and that they can have a negative or a positive effect depending on how we use them.
Well, I sort of hadn't considered like the meta implications of that, the Dementor arriving on Privet Drive being kind of like a literary technique to remind the reader that, now it's getting real for you. I just sort of thought it was like a blurring of the world, kind of the way Aunt Petunia knows more about the magical world than she has ever let anyone know, including her husband. The way I sort of listened ahead, but the way they get to the ministry, we saw some of that, I guess, in the beginning of book 4, and there's always been like moments of interface, right? But usually those moments where the primary world of London and the magical world of, wizards, usually when we see them colliding, it's because they are, the characters are moving from one world to another. They're like crossing a threshold from, say, platform 9 to platform 9 3/4, or, from Privet Drive to Hogwarts, or something like that on a flying car. But I think, there isn't a lot of, they do fly, I guess, in chapter 3 or 4, but there isn't when the Dementor arrives, nobody's moving from the Muggle world to the Wizarding world. It's just sort of like you said, like a trespass or an interruption. I don't know. To me, it's more, I didn't see it as a meta comment on like story, but I saw it kind of more as a representation of what emotions do. Like they trespass, they interrupt, they explode, they cross boundaries when you don't want them to, right? Dementors are supposed to be at Azkaban, just like all of your feelings are supposed to be, tucked away in proper little boxes that you deal with when you go to yoga. But that simmering anger that he is feeling, and he, explodes at Dudley, explodes at his, at his aunt and uncle, at Ron and Hermione, at other people, who really just want the best for him, with the exception of the Dursleys. But, a lot of that is like, it's misdirected. It's things being out of order and and out of control, maybe just beyond your reach. And so they pop out every now and then. Like the way Aunt Petunia announces or explains that piece of magic. I'm forgetting exactly what specific piece it is, but it's almost like she didn't even know she knew it, or that she was going to say that before it just came out of her mouth. Like there's just some stuff that you can't control, and maybe pretending like it's not there, or I don't know that, or he's not coming back, or it's all good, I feel fine. Like that kind of pretense, it doesn't work. Like it might work temporarily, but we all know that it doesn't work in the long run, individually, interpersonally, societally. Like this falsehood that like there are even boundaries. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense, but
you're making perfect sense.
I sort of,
yeah,
that's how I saw that, honestly. Yeah.
And what you were mentioning was Aunt Petunia's knowledge that Dementors guarded Azkaban. But Wes, what did you make of that? I'm not trying to set anything up, but it does remind me of both the story of sort of Adam and Eve and also the story of sort of the Buddha as Peterson tells it, just of sort of walls that are eternal seeming and keep out all the bad things that inevitably crumble and let something like a bad idea or the thought of death or generally the thought of death is how it works with the Buddhists and with the and in the Eden story. Sarah, I completely agree with you that it's emotions breaking in on your consciousness and showing you who's really in charge, and that I just think that's a very powerful interpretation. And I guess I just wanted to also make those two other connections, see whether they're appropriate, and then ask Wes, what do you think about that? Because I thought that was very strong.
The Buddha connection, I'm not sure how to go there exactly. I mean, in a general sense, I could see the idea like that you sort of are conscious of death.
Oh, sorry. That comes from the specific story of how he gets exposed to death after his father, the king, keeps him within a sort of paradisical garden. He gets exposed to an old man and thus learns about death, and that destroys his sort of happy state when he's young. I'm not making a general Buddhist comment. I'm referring to a specific story about the Buddha that directly relates to the Genesis story.
So like the consciousness of death, though, like that's the
right.
That's sort of the thing.
Right. That's what breaks in on him and destroys his initial sort of naive inner peace.
Well, yeah. I mean, at this point, we have to imagine that Harry is capable of killing, right? Like we have to sort of have that somewhere in our heads, and so that's sort of like the ultimate expression of this anger that he's, bottled up and released, and like that's sort of wrecking his his happy picture of even of Ron and Hermione at this point, right? So it's like that is sort of the that and then the idea that there is something like worse than death, which seems to be what the Dementors can also represent, right? Like to lose your soul in the kiss is worse than dying, simply like leaving the world, and so that seems to be also there too, like in the background. Or you could think of like Neville Longbottom's parents. So something like that. I mean, I kind of feel like Harry is, he's not killing anyone, but he's close to it with Dudley, and then saves his life, of course. But he's also like really not doing a terribly good job of forgiving Ron and Hermione, or at least not at this point.
No.
For leaving him in the dark for a long time over the summer. Making him ignominiously dig out newspapers and then not actually read the newspapers very carefully, right? Like it's weird. It's a weird conflict that sort of is brewing there. But again, I can sort of sympathize with him if he's gone through so much and he's had so many things taken away from him. But at this point, it's almost like he's pushing things away from him also.
See,
I agree.
And
yeah, go on, Sarah.
I was just going to say I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist or well versed in any of those fields, but it does seem to me that like his anger at not receiving news from Hermione and Ron, that's not really why he's mad at them. And I don't know that he's actually mad at them. I think he's mad at his circumstance. And that's part of why I think he's like, I think that's part of why Sirius gravitates towards Harry and maybe blurs the line between parent, godparent, and child. And I think that's part of why he feels comforted around his godfather, is that, like, I think he's angry that he witnessed his mother and his father, well, at least his mother, die, but he had no limited conscious memory of it. And what memory he did have of it came in fits and starts, and it terribly disturbed him. But there was literally nothing he could have done. And I guess I'm just saying this from the perspective, I mean, we're all teachers. I don't know if any of you have had the terrible misfortune of losing a student, but I have. And I've been to more funerals of young people than I care to say. Some by their own hand, which are extraordinarily difficult, and some, freak medical scenario or a car accident. And there is nothing more, the funerals for young people are just different. They're just different. And you are faced with this ugly, unjust, unfair, inappropriate reality of our world. It is wrong that people that age die. And I sympathize with Harry in this moment because I have felt the rage that he feels. It's yes, he's angry that they didn't write him or give him information, but I think he's angry at what he had to witness. Or at least that's how I understand the extremity of his rage, and how nothing that he blames it on is really that bad. And he's not crazy, but I think he's just haunted. And there's a level of
sorry.
No, go for it.
I think you hit it. I think what might be because what you see is that there's something underlying the rage, and you're connecting that to Cedric's death. And I think perhaps more specifically, could it be the fact that Harry is questioning why he survived Voldemort and destroyed him, and on the one hand, and then on the other hand, Cedric, who was so great at everything, was just callously killed by him. And then Harry had some part in then bringing Voldemort back around, so that there's some sort of crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a twisted guilt happening here. I mean, again, I'm not a psychologist. I've seen enough of the psychobabble TV shows to maybe like pretend, but I'm not, but I think there's, so that story about the Buddha, I am not familiar with the story, but the Adam and Eve story, right? The knowledge of good and evil, like the knowledge of your mortality. Like when you come face to face with that, that is not inconsequential. And like, I think that is, and I think that's why there's like, that's why it all seems like he's overreacting, right? Like, cool it, bud, enjoy your summer. Or actually freaking pick up the newspaper, the Daily Prophet, and read it, right? He's not totally daft. I think there's a part of him that actually doesn't want information because it would confirm what he has done, right? And not that he was actively, excited about being a party to the return of Voldemort, but he was there. He had a wand, and he clearly was somehow able to or ordained to survive again. And there's an inappropriateness that I sense from his circumstance that I think I'm like reading into some of the way he reacts to people. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but that story of the Buddha being like fundamentally altered, right? Is that the story by yes. Like coming face to face for the first time with like people die?
Yeah, he's exposed in three different
intense.
ways. Yeah, the first one is to somebody who's, I think, crooked with disease. The second one is someone who's old. And then the third one is someone who's dead. And he asks his advisor each time, what is that? And each time the man answered, a man. And Buddha says, well, I'm a man. Does that mean that will happen to me? And the advisor says, well, certainly, as you are a man, these things will happen to you. And sort of he retreats back into his home, but then comes back out and keeps being exposed over and over again to these truths that he then has to sort of face.
I mean, I know that this isn't a podcast on Shakespeare, but this is something that when I was teaching at Gonzaga, we one of the classes I taught was classic lit, and following on the heels of the Inferno was Hamlet. And I think Hamlet is a great example of someone who is not actually angry with anybody without just cause. I mean, he's angry at his uncle because his uncle deserves it. But I think he's really like terrified at the prospect of death. He doesn't understand it for all of his philosophy. It doesn't, it's the one thing he should understand about humanity, but he doesn't quite get it, and it haunts him. And it's not until the end when he like makes his peace with the fact that like, if my death be not now, it will come. And like tears in his eyes, he goes off to this great duel, not knowing he's going to die, but comfortable with it. And I don't know, I think that's something, it sounds really morbid, but it's something that I think is like at the heart of a lot of classic literature, is like coming to terms with this thing that like is both wrong and right. It's wrong when it happens to people like Cedric, and when you feel like you could have done something about it, or maybe you should have done something about it. I don't know. That's more than any 15-year-old should have to handle in my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like that's part of what's behind the sort of overtures that Sirius is making here to Harry, right? Like, there's something a little off about this. Like, he's kind of pushing Harry more into the adult world, right? But it's sort of like there's also a rightness about it because Harry's already been pushed into that world, and so he sort of deserves to like know a little bit about what he's up against. So it's that same kind of like wrongness and rightness seems like it's kind of active with Sirius, and
yeah.
Mrs. Weasley has a similar, like, she's right in a way and she's wrong in a way, and it's really interesting, their kind of little argument there. I don't know, like, there's a few big arguments that we see, Harry yelling at Dudley, and Harry yelling at his aunt and uncle, and then Harry yelling at Ron and Hermione, but also Sirius, like, doing his bit of arguing here. He's like, this is his house, and he's Harry's godfather, and by golly, he's gonna let Harry like know a little bit more about what's going on here, and the reader too, for that matter, right? Like, we're probably kind of chomping at the bit, just like know what the heck is going on, because that's all we've been getting for like 80 pages so far. It's like, we want to know what's going on, and it's very tantalizing what they sort of come to, right? Like, something that even Voldemort couldn't get before is like what he's trying to get now, and that's when we finally get sent to bed. And I don't know, like there's some interesting kind of a conflict between people who both want the right thing for Harry there, which is a new kind of a level of complexity maybe.
And just to go meta again, just to what extent is that an inner sort of monologue and conflict within the writer herself, J.K. Rowling, between the sort of Aragorn-like ranger who knows the darkness, who can bring us to knowledge of things we did not know before, and the maternal, motherly figure of Mrs. Weasley, who's been around far longer than the serious dark figure has, though he is the one that has the rights to us, technically, which is interesting. To what extent is this an inner conflict within J.K. Rowling that she solves by slowly bringing us into the fold, slowly exposing us to evil? To what extent is she sort of educating us or bringing us forward and into the world, helping to develop us as young people into more capable young people, more understanding of the darkness in the world and sort of our place within it?
No, I think that's a great point. Like, how is I think when we looked at on fairy stories, we talked about maybe the fantasy author as like, the secondary world creator is godlike, but she's also, like you said, as soon as it turns into holding up a mirror and not just creating another world, but also saying something about the primary world in it, there is an educative or an educational piece of this. I think that's an interesting piece. Wes, what you mentioned about like getting to learn the big kid information, but then being sent to bed. I mean, that is just, to me, the height of adolescence, right? Like, we've been talking about this all along, like, you know, burgeoning sexuality with the mandrakes in book 2 and all of the social dynamics that they start to display or display poorly, the kinds of things that are developmentally appropriate. Like, this is the time when, like, the world gets dark and you get emo, right? And like that, I think that this is like this makes sense, at least to me as a former adolescent and an observer of adolescence on a daily basis, that like that kind of moodiness that he is prone to is particular, but like then being sent off to bed because now we reach the point where you're not old enough to handle it, right? Like, that's just
right.
Like, you can drive, but you can't vote, right? Or you can get a job, but you have to be home at this time. Like, those types of like emergence versus like regression. I don't know. I think that's a pretty good metaphor for growing up, but it makes something that you were saying, Alex, earlier about like when you asked what does it mean that there is a person behind the like you have to like mean things, that there has to be some kind of like emotional component behind the language of a spell or the movement of a wand. It just means that I feel like that them going to school is just as our students are, is about knowledge of self rather than it is about knowledge of trigonometry, as important as that might be for, say, like building a bridge. It just means that like what they do at their school needs to be at its core teaching them to know who they are, so they can put like the appropriate part of themselves into the language of whatever it is that they're trying to do. I think Tonks is a pretty good example of that. Like somebody who, like, she's a great character. She might be my favorite. Who like always wants to help in the kitchen, but like never learned any of the spells to help in the kitchen. And I think, yes, she's a great example of somebody who like maybe doesn't quite totally know herself yet, but like she's a young person. I don't know. I think that sort of,
and I think that's represented right by her ability, right? She can still morph into things, physically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a young person who's still protean, who can still pick their path to some extent. She does change her hair so often, I think. And she doesn't call herself an animagus. It's a funny sort of magus. There's an extra syllable to it. I don't know if either of y'all recall that. In any case, we can look
it's something morph, like some, I don't know.
Oh yeah,
what it is
that
exactly.
also sounds right. Yeah, and morphe, the form, the platonic forms. In any case, I want to ask you just one last question before we go tonight about what did y'all think of Creature in the Black Manor with the screaming black portrait, Mrs. Black, the mother of Sirius, and how it has to be covered. But more about Creature, and also more specifically, what did you think of Hermione's perception of Creature sort of sympathetically taking the sort of, let's see, the root causes of his behavior perspective, and Ron's sort of disgust with Creature and Sirius is also hating of him. What did y'all think of that? Because Creature is very different from Winky and Dobby.
I thought he's pretty like adolescent in a way, like he's very sullen, and he'll sort of like shoot you a dirty look when you're not looking. He's like he represents something of that as well. And he's terrifying, frankly, and so is the picture that they have to keep covered because it just like yells at them all the time. Like that's a pretty powerful evocation of like the complete opposite of Harry Potter, who's like got this, lack of a family, and that tears him up. Well, Sirius has this like overbearing family, and that's tearing him up, in sort of an equal and opposite horrible way.
Right, and we even literally find out at his home that he is related, that most purebloods like him are related, and that he is related to Bellatrix Lestrange, as well as to the Malfoys of all people. And I do think it's interesting that he's sullen in the same way that Sirius is, as if being exposed to that sort of Freudian monster mother does something like that, stunts the man, as it were, to some extent, and to keep him forever, as she now has done with Sirius, who is imprisoned there with her and with Creature. Perhaps it is a comment on the power of a mother to stunt the growth of a man so that he'll never fly free, and that is what has made Sirius so resentful, because he has been imprisoned so much of his adult life, hasn't he? And I suppose that's also metaphorically what it means to be imprisoned by one's family. Like, you stay in that psychological state and then you produce this physical state around you. It's like Sirius will never, ever exist outside of prison, which is a depressing thing to say.
That's really sad. But he experienced like a lot of unusual freedom at the age of 17. True. When he ran away, right? So it's almost as though he didn't kind of fly the nest in a normal way. I think it's interesting to like contrast that with Molly Weasley, who seems a little overbearing,
right?
But maybe, right, like is another mom in the same space. I don't know. I'm not really sure where to go from there, but I think we're supposed to see her, I think, as a far more ideal mother. Maybe not the ideal, but I guess I could be wrong. But someone who knows like what is appropriate, is like unswayed by like whiny children. I think the situation with Percy is particularly interesting because I think it points out that, like, I don't know, you can have great parents, and parents can be great with a variety of different kids, but look at how different all of their children are, right? The parents are the exact same. The home is similar. I mean, it evolves as their kids, grow into it. But I think I'm that division between Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Percy. I don't know. It seems awfully reminiscent of something we were talking about with Mr. Crouch and young Mr. Crouch, about like fathers and sons or mothers and sons. I'm not sure. I don't really have anything else besides that.
No, I know. I feel like I'm in the same place. So, Wes, is there something, did you want to comment on that to bring it home, or did you have something else?
I had been thinking about Percy and sort of how he fits into this, but it seems like, he sort of represents a turn to, like ambition or something like that, which Sirius has rejected, right? Like they're an interesting parallel as well, right? Because Sirius has this very noble and wealthy family, which he has like rejected, whereas Percy's got this great, good, but poor and sort of not very notable or whatever family, which he has rejected. So they sort of cross paths in a real interesting way there. Percy has been not a very likable character from the start, and he sort of actually gets a little more interesting, I feel like, as the series goes on, and he's not just trying to be like the perfect model student anymore. Now he's sort of like he's really like thrown his lot in with the ministry, and he's really gonna just see where that takes him. It seems like, to the extent that he'll be a kind of a traitor to his family. It's rough.
I know to some extent he reminds me of those of our friends from St. John's who got the PhD rather than going the independent route. But I know that's harsh and funny thing to say. That said, there are some controversies going on in the humanities departments these days, and some interesting things being said about old Hogwarts, if we can make that connection. And so I suppose we're going to have to make sure that Albus Dumbledore stays in charge and keep doing these sorts of podcasts so that we can shed some light on what's going on. Well, y'all, I'm still loving listening to Audible, imbibing stories in the original way. And so I'd love to do as many chapters as y'all can conceivably ingest and want to speak of. I'm ready to Caesarean march through this thing. But I could also take my time as well. I could either be Italian or Roman about this as y'all desire. What do y'all think?
Well, Wes, what do you think? What's doable for you? I am on midwinter break next week, so I've got nothing but time.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. I mean, we would meet Professor Umbridge if we got through 12, and we would have detention with her if we got through 13.
Oh, damn. Does through 12, I mean, we did 6 for today. Does another 6 sound doable?
Yeah, because that gets us we get to meet a lot of interesting new characters. So yeah, that seems good. Through 12.
Okay. Well, awesome,
so
y'all.
Through 12.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And just so the listeners know, just to give y'all some public love, y'all switched days from Monday to Wednesday for me this week, and I really appreciated that. So thank you very much, y'all. And I'm really looking forward to doing this next one with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks.
All right.
You.
Take it easy.
Take it easy.
Bye.